My name is Paul Jackson, and I'm 69 years old, sitting here in my empty house in Denver, Colorado, staring at bank statements that show a balance of $87 where there used to be $43,000 in life savings. Because while I was drowning in grief after finding my wife's lifeless body hanging in our garage, my own children systematically robbed me blind under the guise of helping with funeral expenses. 3 months ago, I lost Linda to suicide, and within days of burying the woman I loved for 38 years, I discovered that my children had used my devastation as an opportunity to steal everything I had worked for my entire life. I'd love to know where you're listening from today, so please share your location in the comments below. And if this story moves you, I hope you'll consider subscribing, because what happened to me shows how vulnerable grief can make us and how even our own children can become predators when they smell weakness and desperation. Let me start by telling you about Linda, so you can understand what her loss meant to me and why her death left me so completely defenseless against the people who should have protected me. Linda Marie Sullivan became Linda Jackson when we married in 1985, a beautiful 27-year-old nurse with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to sparkle with life and mischief. She was everything I wasn't: outgoing, optimistic, and blessed with an ability to find joy in the smallest moments of everyday life. I was 31 when we met, a quiet accountant who had resigned myself to a life of solitude after a series of failed relationships had convinced me that I wasn't the kind of man who inspired lasting love. But Linda saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, and she pursued our relationship with a determination that both flattered and terrified me. We built a beautiful life together in a modest 2-story house on the outskirts of Denver, where Linda filled every room with laughter, music, and the warm chaos of a woman who collected stray cats, grew elaborate gardens, and turned every holiday into a celebration worthy of a magazine cover. She had a gift for making our house feel like a sanctuary where anything was possible and every day was an adventure. Linda and I were blessed with 3 children who became the center of our universe. Jessica was born in 1987. A serious little girl who inherited her mother's nurturing instincts and became a pediatric nurse like Linda. Marcus followed in 1989, a charming boy who grew into a charismatic man working in sales for a medical device company. Our youngest, Amanda, came along in 1992 and developed into an artist with her mother's creative spirit and eye for beauty. For over 3 decades, our family functioned like a well-orchestrated symphony, with Linda as a conductor who kept us all in harmony. She remembered every birthday, anniversary, and milestone. She organized family vacations, holiday gatherings, and Sunday dinners that brought us together regularly and maintained the bonds that held our family unit together. I was a steady provider, working long hours as a senior accountant for a construction company to ensure our family's financial security. I wasn't a fun parent or the one the children came to with their problems, but I was reliable, dependable, and devoted to creating the stable foundation that allowed Linda to be the emotional heart of our family. Linda struggled with depression throughout our marriage, a condition that waxed and waned with the seasons and the stresses of life. She had periods of darkness where she would withdraw into herself, spending days in bed and struggling to find energy for basic daily activities. But she always seemed to pull herself out of these episodes, often with the help of therapy, medication, and the unwavering support of our family. I learned to recognize the warning signs of Linda's depressive episodes and provide the extra support and patience she needed during these difficult times. Our children also understood their mother's condition and rallied around her when she was struggling, creating a protective circle of love that had always been sufficient to see her through her darkest moments. But something changed in Linda during the winter of 2022. Her depression became deeper and more persistent than anything we had experienced before. She stopped taking care of herself, lost interest in activities she had always enjoyed, and began talking about feeling hopeless and worthless in ways that frightened me. I tried to encourage Linda to seek professional help, to adjust her medication, or to consider hospitalization if necessary. But she resisted my suggestions and seemed to resent any implication that her condition was serious enough to require intervention. She accused me of not understanding her feelings and insisted that she just needed time and space to work through her problems. Our children were also concerned about Linda's condition, but they lived their own busy lives in different parts of the country and weren't able to provide the daily support and monitoring that her condition required. Jessica lived in California with her husband and 2 young children. Marcus was in Chicago building his career and recently divorced. Amanda had moved to New York to pursue her art and was struggling financially to establish herself in a competitive field. The distance meant that our children saw Linda during holidays and occasional visits, when she was often able to put on a brave face and hide the extent of her suffering. They knew she was going through a difficult period, but I don't think any of them understood how serious her condition had become or how worried I was about her safety. I tried to manage Linda's care while maintaining my work responsibilities and keeping our family functioning normally. I cooked meals she wouldn't eat, cleaned the house she no longer maintained, and spent sleepless nights watching her sleep to make sure she was still breathing. The stress and worry were overwhelming, but I was determined to help her through this crisis just as we had weathered previous episodes together. In hindsight, I can see that I should have been more aggressive about getting Linda professional help or involving our children more directly in her care. But at the time, I was trying to respect her autonomy and her wishes while hoping that love and patience would be enough to bring her back to us. The morning of April 18th, 2023 started like many others during that terrible period. Linda had spent the previous day in bed, refusing to eat or engage in conversation. I brought her coffee and toast before leaving for work, kissed her forehead, and told her I loved her just as I had done every morning for months. When I came home that evening, I found Linda's body hanging from a rope in our garage. She had left no note, no explanation, no final words to help us understand why she had chosen to end her life. The sight of her lifeless body destroyed something fundamental in my psyche and left me unable to think clearly or function normally for weeks afterward. The next few hours were a blur of police officers, paramedics, coroners, and neighbors who tried to provide comfort while I sat in shock on my front steps, unable to comprehend that Linda was gone forever. I couldn't process the practical details that needed attention or make coherent decisions about anything that required my input. Jessica flew in from California the next morning and immediately took charge of the situation with the efficiency and competence she had learned from her mother. She contacted the funeral home, began making arrangements for service, and handled the phone calls from friends and relatives who were learning about Linda's death. Marcus arrived from Chicago the following day and focused on the legal and financial details that Linda's death required. He contacted our attorney, our insurance companies, and the various institutions that needed to be notified about Linda's passing. He also began researching the costs associated with funeral services and burial arrangements. Amanda was the last to arrive because she had to arrange time off from her job and scrape together money for airline tickets. When she finally made it to Denver, she was emotional and devastated, unable to function effectively or contribute to practical arrangements that her siblings were handling. In those first few days after Linda's death, I was grateful to have children who could step in and manage the overwhelming details that I was too distraught to handle myself. They seemed to be working together efficiently and competently, and I felt blessed to have raised children who could support their father during the worst crisis of his life. Jessica explained that funeral costs were higher than I might expect, especially for the kind of service that would properly honor Linda's memory and provide comfort to the many people who had loved her. She estimated that we would need approximately $15,000 to cover the funeral home fees, burial plot, casket, flowers, catering for the reception, and other associated expenses. Marcus supported Jessica's assessment and added that there might be additional costs that we hadn't anticipated, such as legal fees related to settling Linda's estate, medical bills that insurance might not cover, and travel expenses for relatives who would be coming from out of state for the funeral. Amanda agreed with her siblings that we should spare no expense in giving their mother the beautiful send-off she deserved. She talked about Linda's love of flowers and music and suggested that we hire a string quartet for the service and fill the funeral home with the kinds of elaborate floral arrangements that Linda had always created for special occasions. In my grief-stricken state, I didn't question these estimates or ask for detailed breakdowns of projected costs. The thought of haggling over money while planning Linda's funeral felt obscene and disrespectful to her memory. I wanted to honor her with the most beautiful service possible, regardless of the financial cost. I also wasn't thinking clearly about my financial situation or my long-term security. The shock of Linda's suicide had left me unable to focus on practical matters or make rational decisions about anything requiring complex reasoning. I was operating on pure emotion and instinct, trusting my children to guide me through decisions I wasn't capable of making myself. When Jessica told me that the funeral expenses would require approximately $20,000 up front, with additional costs that might bring the total to $25,000, I immediately agreed to provide whatever money was needed. I gave her access to our joint savings account and told her to withdraw whatever amount was necessary to ensure that Linda received the beautiful farewell she deserved. But as the week progressed and more unexpected expenses arose, the amount of money my children needed continued to increase. Marcus discovered that Linda's life insurance policy had a suicide clause that would delay payment for several months, meaning that we would need to cover all expenses immediately from our personal savings. Jessica found additional costs related to the burial plot, the grave marker, and fees charged by the cemetery for opening and closing the grave. She also decided that Linda deserved a higher quality casket than the one they had originally selected, which added several $1,000s to our expenses. Amanda insisted that we hire a professional photographer to document the funeral service and create a memorial album that would preserve our memories of Linda's final celebration. She also wanted to commission a local artist to create a custom memorial piece that could be displayed at the service and later installed in our home. Each new expense was presented as essential to properly honoring Linda's memory, and each was accompanied by emotional appeals about what Linda would have wanted and what she deserved after a lifetime of selfless devotion to our family. In my weakened emotional state, I couldn't bear the thought of denying Linda anything that might make her funeral more beautiful or meaningful. By the time all the arrangements were finalized, my children had withdrawn nearly $43,000 from our savings accounts, virtually emptying the retirement fund that Linda and I had built over 4 decades of careful financial management. I signed check after check and approved withdrawal after withdrawal, trusting that my children were acting in good faith and managing our money responsibly. The funeral service itself was beautiful, but surprisingly modest considering the enormous amount of money we had spent. The casket was nice but not extravagant. The flowers were lovely but not overwhelming, and the reception was simple with basic catering that seemed appropriate but hardly luxurious. I was too devastated by grief to pay close attention to the details of the service or to analyze whether the quality matched the cost we had incurred. I was focused on saying goodbye to Linda and getting through the most difficult day of my life, not on conducting a financial audit of funeral arrangements. But in the weeks following the funeral, as I began to emerge in the fog of acute grief and started paying attention to practical matters again, I began to notice discrepancies between what we had supposedly paid for and what had actually been provided. The flowers at the service had been beautiful, but relatively simple arrangements that couldn't have cost more than a few $100s. The catering had consisted of basic sandwiches, salad, and coffee that might have cost $300 or $400 for the number of people who attended. The string quartet that Amanda had insisted was essential for the service had never materialized. When I called the funeral home to request an itemized breakdown of our expenses, I discovered that the total cost of Linda's funeral had been less than $8,000, including the casket, burial plot, and all associated fees. This was far less than the $43,000 my children had withdrawn from our accounts for funeral expenses. I was confused and alarmed by this discrepancy and immediately contacted Jessica to ask for an explanation. Her response was evasive and defensive, claiming that there had been many additional expenses that I might not be aware of and that she would provide me with detailed receipts when she had time to organize her records. But weeks passed without any documentation or explanation from Jessica, and my repeated requests for information were met with excuses and delays. Marcus claimed that he had forwarded all his receipts to Jessica and referred me back to her for answers. Amanda said she had been too grief-stricken to keep careful records but would try to reconstruct her expenses from memory. As I pressed for answers and became more insistent about seeing documentation for how our money had been spent, my children's responses became increasingly hostile and defensive. They accused me of being ungrateful for their help during my time of crisis and suggested that I was being inappropriate by questioning their handling of Linda's funeral arrangements. Jessica told me that she was hurt and offended by my implications that she had mismanaged our money. She reminded me that she had taken time off work and spent her own money on travel expenses to come home and help me during the worst week of my life. She said my questioning of her integrity was unfair and hurtful. Marcus became angry when I suggested that the funeral costs seemed excessive compared to what had actually been provided. He accused me of trying to put a price tag on his mother's memory and said that I should be grateful to have children who were willing to ensure that Linda received a proper send-off regardless of cost. Amanda cried when I asked her to provide receipts for the memorial projects she had commissioned. She said that grief had made her forget about money and that she had just wanted to create something beautiful to honor her mother's memory. She claimed that my focus on financial details showed that I didn't understand the emotional value of the tributes she had arranged. But as I continued my investigation into our funeral expenses, the truth began to emerge through other sources. I discovered that Jessica had used several $1,000s of our money to pay off credit card debts that she had accumulated during her recent financial struggles. Marcus had withdrawn money to cover his divorce attorney fees and to make a down payment on a new car. Amanda had used our savings to pay overdue rent and to purchase art supplies for her studio. The revelation that my children had stolen from me during the worst period of my life was almost as devastating as losing Linda. Not only had they betrayed my trust and exploited my grief, but they had done so while positioning themselves as loving children who were sacrificing to help their bereaved father. The cruelty and calculation required to rob a grieving man while pretending to arrange his wife's funeral was beyond anything I had imagined my own children could be capable of. They had seen my devastation and vulnerability as an opportunity for personal gain, and they had worked together to systematically drain our savings while I was too broken to protect myself. When I confronted them with evidence of their theft, their responses revealed the extent of their callousness and greed. Jessica claimed that she deserved compensation for the time and effort she had spent managing Linda's funeral arrangements. Marcus argued that he had a right to early inheritance since Linda's death had reminded him of life's uncertainty. Amanda said that Linda would have wanted her to have money to pursue her artistic dreams. None of them showed remorse for their actions or offered to return the money they had stolen. Instead, they became defensive and hostile, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful for questioning their actions. They seemed to genuinely believe that they were entitled to our money and that my objections were unreasonable. The betrayal destroyed what remained of our family relationships. Not only had I lost Linda to suicide, but I had also lost my children to greed and dishonesty. The people I had counted on to help me through the worst crisis of my life had instead exploited my vulnerability to rob me of my financial security. The practical consequences of their theft were severe and immediate. With virtually no savings remaining, I was unable to maintain the house that Linda and I had shared for decades. I couldn't afford the mortgage payments, property taxes, utilities, and maintenance costs on my accountant's salary alone, especially as I approached retirement age. I was forced to sell the house and move into a small apartment, abandoning the home where Linda and I had built our life together and raised our children. The house sale provided some temporary financial relief, but most of the proceeds went to paying off debts and covering the cost of downsizing. The emotional toll was even worse than the financial damage. I was struggling with complicated grief over Linda's suicide while simultaneously dealing with the betrayal and loss of my children. The depression that followed was deeper and more persistent than anything I had experienced before, and I began to understand some of what Linda might have felt during her final months. I considered legal action against my children for theft and fraud, but my attorney explained that proving criminal intent would be difficult since I had voluntarily given them access to our accounts and had approved many of the withdrawals. The fact that they were family members and had been acting under guise of helping with legitimate expenses would make prosecution challenging. The attorney also warned me that pursuing legal action against my children would likely destroy any remaining possibility of reconciling our relationships and might result in expensive litigation with uncertain outcomes. At my age and in my emotional state, the stress and cost of legal battles might cause more harm than good. I spent months in isolation and despair, cut off from my children, and struggling to rebuild my life in circumstances I had never imagined facing. The apartment felt like a prison compared to a home I'd shared with Linda, and the silence was overwhelming after decades of family gatherings and holiday celebrations. But something unexpected happened 8 months after Linda's death that would begin to change the trajectory of my story. I received a phone call from my neighbor from our old house, Mrs. Eleanor Rodriguez, who had maintained contact with me since my move and had been concerned about my well-being. Mrs. Rodriguez told me that she had been contacted by a woman named Patricia Williams, who identified herself as Amanda's roommate in New York. Patricia had gotten Mrs. Rodriguez's contact information from Amanda and had reached out because she was concerned about something she had discovered. Patricia explained that Amanda had been living beyond her means since returning from Linda's funeral, purchasing expensive art supplies, paying for studio space, and going on shopping sprees that seemed inconsistent with her previously tight finances. When Patricia had asked Amanda about her sudden financial windfall, Amanda had drunkenly confessed to stealing money from her grieving father. Patricia was horrified by Amanda's admission and felt compelled to contact someone in our family to report what she had learned. She had tried to reach Jessica and Marcus, but had been unable to get responses to her calls and emails. Mrs. Rodriguez was the only family contact she could find. Patricia provided Mrs. Rodriguez with detailed information about Amanda's spending patterns and admissions about the theft. She also mentioned that Amanda had talked about Jessica and Marcus taking money as well, and that all three siblings had planned the theft together during the week of Linda's funeral. This information was devastating, but also validating, as it confirmed what I had suspected, but hadn't been able to prove definitively. Patricia was willing to provide written testimony about Amanda's confessions, which might be useful if I decided to pursue legal action or try to recover some of the stolen money. Mrs. Rodriguez also connected me with a support group for elderly people who had been financially abused by family members. This group met weekly at a local community center and provided both emotional support and practical advice for seniors who had been exploited by relatives. Attending these support group meetings was initially difficult because it required admitting that I had been victimized by my own children and acknowledging the extent of my financial and emotional losses. But gradually, I found comfort in connecting with other people who had experienced similar betrayals and understood the complex emotions involved in family financial abuse. The group leader, Dr. Sandra Martinez, was a social worker who specialized in elder abuse and family dysfunction. She helped me understand that financial exploitation of vulnerable family members was more common than most people realized, and that my experience was part of a larger pattern of abuse that often occurred during times of crisis and grief. Dr. Martinez also connected me with legal aid services that specialize in helping elderly victims of financial abuse recover stolen assets. These attorneys worked on a contingency basis and had experience with cases involving family members who had exploited vulnerable relatives. With legal aid representation, I was able to file civil lawsuits against all three of my children for fraud, theft, and elder abuse. The evidence that Patricia provided about Amanda's confessions, combined with bank records showing the timing and amount of withdrawals, created a strong case for recovery of the stolen funds. The legal process took over a year to resolve, but ultimately, I was able to recover most of the money my children had stolen, plus interest and legal fees. Jessica, Marcus, and Amanda were all required to repay the amounts they had taken, and they faced potential criminal charges if they failed to comply with the court orders. More importantly, the legal victory helped restore my sense of dignity and agency after months of feeling powerless and victimized. While I couldn't undo the betrayal or restore my relationships with my children, I could at least ensure that their actions had consequences and that they couldn't profit from exploiting my grief. The financial recovery also allowed me to make better living arrangements and plan more securely for my retirement years. While I couldn't afford to buy back our family home, I was able to move into a nicer apartment and rebuild emergency savings that Linda and I had worked so hard to accumulate. Perhaps most significantly, my involvement with the Elder Abuse Support Group led me to become an advocate for other seniors who had been exploited by family members. I began speaking at community events about the warning signs of financial abuse and the resources available to help victims recover stolen assets. Today, 2 years after Linda's death and the theft that followed, I'm living independently and securely, surrounded by a new community of friends who understand my experiences and provide ongoing support. While I still grieve Linda's loss every day and may never fully recover from her suicide, I've found purpose and meaning in helping other elderly people protect themselves from exploitation. My relationships with Jessica, Marcus, and Amanda remain severed, and I don't expect that to change. They showed me who they really are during my most vulnerable moment, and that knowledge can never be forgotten or forgiven. But I've learned that family is not just about blood relationships, and that it's possible to build meaningful connections with people who share your values and treat you with respect. The experience taught me that grief makes us vulnerable in ways we don't expect, and that even our closest family members can become predators when they sense weakness and opportunity. But it also showed me that recovery is possible, that justice sometimes prevails, and that there are people willing to fight for elderly victims who have been betrayed by those they trusted most. That's my story. How my children used my wife's suicide and my devastating grief as an opportunity to rob me blind, but how I fought back with legal help and community support to reclaim my dignity and financial security. Sometimes the people who should protect us during our darkest hours become the ones we need protection from, but sometimes we find the strength and allies we need to seek justice and rebuild our lives.